The foreign policy changes made by John F. Kennedy during the Cold War era both positively and negatively affected how the government dealt with increasing hostilities with different communist countries. John F. Kennedy was an American politician that served as the 35th President of the United States from January 1961 until he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in November of 1963. JFK was a very influential president, making many foreign and domestic policies before he was assassinated in 1963. Some of these include the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the establishment of the Peace Corps, advancements in space race, the Berlin Wall, and the Civil Rights Movement. Although there were many changes and advancements in foreign policy during this time period, there was also a great deal of continuity relating to the previous presidency with Eisenhower and his relations with foreign countries. Kennedy was the youngest president to get elected into office, and he was the first Roman Catholic president to serve. Many American people thought that his presidency represented a youthfulness that was an ideal after World War I and II. Close to his third year in office, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated while campaigning for his next term as president. On November 22, 1963, he was shot in the back of the head and neck, and the governor was also shot in the chest while waving to citizens in the back of the car.
From Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
President's wife, Jackie Kennedy, was not hurt. She walked into the hospital at her husband's stretcher.
This public murder that was caught on film still happens to be one of the most traumatic events in history. Oswald was found as being a major suspect of this shooting after he shot a police officer while fleeing his home. He was later shot by Jack Ruby while being transported by police. In his inaugural speech, John F. Kennedy mentioned many things relating to his plans for presidency.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world,
JFK is a beloved and well-remembered president, particularly due to the foreign policy decisions that were made by Kennedy during his time serving. Though he had many great choices made when he was president, one that is seen as an error was the Bay of Pigs scenario that occurred from April 17th to the 19th in 1961. As the increasing threat of communism was still at its height during the Cold War era, the US's main goal was to contain and keep away potential communist threats. With trying to halt the spread of communism in Cuba, the United States government and President John F. Kennedy thought that attacking Cuba with American-trained Cuban exiles would overpower the Prime Minister of Cuba at this time, Fidel Castro. His plan overall backfired because Cuba had way more troops ready to fight than the U.S. was expecting, letting the U.S. know that Cuba knew this was not a surprise attack. The Bay of Pigs catastrophe overall helped Cuba develop a stronger relationship with Fidel Castro, and backfired completely as Castro said soon after that he was pursuing a stronger relationship with the Soviet Union, which is the opposite of what the U.S. government wanted. Because this attack happened in 1961, towards the beginning of Kennedy's presidency, it angered some American people, and they questioned Kennedy's ability to be a thoughtful and overall good president.
Well, I would say that there are a good many Americans in the last 15 years who've served their country in a good many different ways, a good many abroad. Some of them have lost their lives. The United States government has not felt that it was helpful to our interests, and particularly in the struggle against this armed doctrine, which we're in struggle all around the world, to go into great details. Let me just say about these four men. They were serving their country. The flight that cost them their lives was a volunteer flight, and that they, while because of the nature of their work, it has not been a matter of public record, as it might be in the case of soldiers or sailors, I can say that they were serving their country, and as I say, their work was volunteer.
Further along in his presidency, John F. Kennedy regained the public's trust with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962, and it was the closest the world has ever gotten to nuclear war. On October the 15th, American air pilots took photos of missiles that were being installed in Cuba from the Soviet Union. In response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the presence of American missiles in Italy and Turkey, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to agree to Cuba's request to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to stop the harassment. An agreement was reached during a secret meeting between Khrushchev and Fidel Castro, and missile sites were starting to be built soon after. Although the United States already had missiles located in Turkey ready to attack the Soviet Union, President John F. Kennedy started discussing options with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or the XCOM. They deliberated and decided to impose a naval blockade on Cuba. Neither side backed down until John F. Kennedy came up with an offer with three components for the Soviet Union to accept or deny. This involved a public deal in which the United States pledged to not invade Cuba if the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles, a private ultimatum threatening to attack Cuba within 24 hours if the offer was rejected, and a secret sweetener that promised to withdraw U.S. missiles from Turkey within 6 months. With this, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved due to the Soviet Union accepting this proposal at the last minute. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows the strength in American foreign affairs and showed how the government was able to fight against communist threats but still maintained good relations between countries. This kept the US from heading into full-fledged nuclear war and was a massive win. This became one of the most successful foreign policy choices made by John F. Kennedy during his presidency, and he was widely known for how he reacted and remained calm through making good choices for the United States and globally.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive, and that if it were other nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Something that is still around today that relates greatly with how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world due to Kennedy is the Peace Corps, which overall helped Americans get connected to other cultures and the rest of the world. The Peace Corps was a major foreign policy choice made by JFK that only brought benefits to American society. The Peace Corps is a volunteer program run by the United States government. It includes providing technical assistance, helping people outside the United States understand American culture, and helping Americans to understand the cultures of other countries. The work is related to social and economic development. This program was established by Executive Order 10924, issued by President John F. Kennedy on March 1, 1961, and was announced by televised broadcast on March 2, 1961. It was authorized by Congress in September of 1961 with passage of the Peace Corps Acts. Volunteers work with governments, schools, nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations, and entrepreneurs in education, business, information technology, agriculture, and in the environment. Thank God. The Peace Corps was created to promote world peace and friendship within countries throughout the rest of the world, establishing connections between other countries and the U.S. As the Peace Corps was created during the time of the Cold War, it was used as a method of showing other nations how a democratic government is a peaceful and great way of living through the help of others.
The willingness of all Americans, men and women, young and old, to serve in the Peace Corps, to serve in all parts of the world, to serve at little pay, to do jobs that most of them have never done before, is one of the most encouraging manifestations of the American spirit that this country has seen in many years. The Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged, our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help. And that hundreds of others of young Americans and older Americans will go overseas to show our best side, to show how much we desire to live at peace. There can be no greater service to our country and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States. I hope that you will join.
Soon after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became involved in a global conflict, the United States with the democratic government and the Soviet Union with communism. Space became an important stage for the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States competing against each other's achievements in the space race. As the Soviet Union succeeded in getting a satellite to space, Sputnik 1, in 1957, JFK wanted to one-up this by sending a man to the moon by the end of the decade. The satellite, Sputnik 1, was a small aluminium ball weighing only 184 pounds. It had a simple radio that could send electronic beeps that could be heard from radio receivers in Earth. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite sent to space.
Immediately after the Sputnik 1 launch, the U.S. Defense Department started to fund a satellite project immediately leading to Eisenhower's funding Project Mercury, hoping to get men into the Earth's orbit. But once again, the Soviet Union beat the U.S. to it. Because of this, once Kennedy was elected in 1960, the space race became even more of a personal issue. Kennedy believed that he needed to get a man on the moon by 1970. In order for the U.S. to be ahead of the Soviet Union when it came to space exploration. Years later, the United States of America became the first country to land a man on the moon successfully. Apollo 11 left Earth on July 16, 1969, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, with Neil Armstrong, Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, and Michael Collins on board. A couple days later, Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon in the lunar module called the Eagle. Without John F. Kennedy's leadership in putting funds and research into making having a man on the moon a priority for the United States, this would have never happened. The space race has left a legacy of Earth communications and weather satellites, and continuing human space presence on the International Space Station. It has also sparked increases in spending on education and research and development, which led to beneficial spin-off technologies. President Kennedy met with the Soviet premier in early 1961, hoping to find a solution to the problems that the United States and the Soviet Union had while avoiding confrontation. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, told Kennedy that if he intervened in him closing the flow of refugees from Berlin, there would be war. So there was no resolution to the meeting they had together. The wall was constructed by the German Democratic Republic of the 13th. On the 13th of August 1961 and was made to cut off West Berlin from East Berlin. Kennedy stated that having the wall cut Berlin into two parts was better than having a war, and the casualties and money that came along with it. Just like President Kennedy, President Eisenhower was more focused on developing nuclear weapons than conventional weapons used for war. In Eisenhower's doctrine, his main goal was to fight communism throughout the different nations, and President JFK's focus was just that as well. Eisenhower, too, got into an arms race and space race with Russia and tried to one-up them with different weapons. The first test of Eisenhower's new foreign policy came when the president failed to negotiate the end of the war in Korea, which is similar to JFK's failure in the Bay of Pigs to maintain peace within the country and try to overthrow the government, as well as the Vietnam War, trying to stop a civil war and help the anti-communist side, which relates to how Eisenhower intervened with Korea as well.
Overall, John F. Kennedy's foreign policy brought a new wave of relations with other countries. His views on communism and how he dealt with issues between the US and other countries helped keep the US at peace with other nations globally. The end.